If these chapters are numbered, I've lost track of them. This chapter involves building a rudder system like a tiller, a daggerboard, spacer Inwales. This is going to be the final chapter before finish work, then rigging, and then it should get on the water. Before I start work on a rudder, a discussion of the hardware in this part. I need some way to make a hinge between the rudder and the transom. I'm found making 2 sets of gudgeons and a drop pin through them all to work well for me. On the transom side go 2 eyes. I end up buying 2 of these turnbuckles just for the single threaded eye on each. I spent a couple bucks because the holes in the eyes are the right size that match that hinge strap I find at Ace Hardware. Some washers and nuts keep things on the transom, while a 3/8 inch threaded rod with some nuts and a washer on top keep it together well. I start with a piece we haven't made yet, that rudder cassette. And I just use it to mark the holes, to line up the holes to drill for those threaded eyes that act as gudgeons. The cassette is definitely not needed for this. Both holes just go in the vertical center line of the transom. The top hole gets drilled about 1 inch below the bottom edge of that transom shelf support piece. The bottom hole is about 1 inch above the top edge of the piece that joins the transom to the sole. The location doesn't need to be precise on these, but they should be about as far apart as it'll allow for those inner trim pieces that'll fit in it. So those inner trim pieces do 2 things. They distribute the force across the transom a little bit, and they look good. I put a taper on mine and softened up the edges. The exterior of the transom needs something similar, but it's to keep it risen off the face of the transom a little bit, but not too far. So I made these little round trim pieces out of 1/2 inch plywood. These also allow the pin to clear that trim piece at the top of the transom that we haven't discussed yet. The hole for the tiller to go through the transom needs to be cut.
The bottom edge should be 3/4 of an inch above the deck of the transom shelf. My opening is 3¼ inches tall in the middle, but that depends on the arc of the transom's top edge. There's should be room at the top of the transom for that trim piece, and then the bottom edge of that trim piece should be the top of your hole. But that needs to be at least maybe 3 inches to give room for the tiller to move a little bit. The width should be 5 inches wide, centered on the transom center line that you lined up your gudgeons on.
I was smart enough to make a clean hole by drilling a pilot hole and then coming in from both sides with a hole saw bit. This cutout will allow the main sheet to attach above the tiller without a traveler getting tied up and causing a tangle in there. It's a lifting point. It allows the boat to rest upside down with weight on the transom. Some people opt for a cut down from the top of the transom with the tiller over the top of it. This transom's plenty tall for that option. I should have cut up to that trim piece line and been more careful with the trim piece to make those match up. Next, to prepare to make that trim piece, I sanded the transom down to a fair curve. This is a piece of ash hardwood to match the gunnels. I had a tough time cutting it to shape. A good bandsaw would have saved me from using an angle grinder and a carving disc to make that concave curve. Also, my trim piece is about a 1/2 inch too tall. I would have liked a little more room for the transom cutout without breaking up that curve. I glued it on with PL Premium and put a flush trim bit on top to clean up a lazy cut. If you trim more than just maybe 1/8 of an inch of that ash, you risk splitting it. I round over a bit, and the sander really cleaned it up nice, and the boat is looking like functional art. Next, we'll move to Inwales. Spacer Inwales are the cherry on top of a little wooden boat. They don't keep water out of the deck, so they're not as seaworthy as a side deck, but they give you unlimited tie-off points. They keep cockpit space. They give you a handle to carry the boat. They add a ton of strength, and they just look fantastic. My gunnels and spacers are 1.25 inches tall. The spacers are 13/16 of an inch thick and 2 3/4 of an inch long. The inwale that's going to span them is a little bit thinner, 11/16 thick, and it's going to run the length of the rail, so about 14 feet. So to make these spacered inwales, you really need 3 pieces of hardwood. I'm using ash. And they need to be about a foot longer than the boat, so mine are 14 feet long. 2 of those 3 pieces are going to be 1.25 inches by 11/16, and the third piece is going to be 1.25 inches by 13/16, and this third piece is going to get cut up to be those 2 3/4 inch spacers. I penciled the 2 3/4 inches on my speed square, made a mark on my speed square, and that made it easy to mark out my spacer cuts. I lined up my spacers before I glued anything down. I put a bracket for a thole pin about 15 inches aft from my main thwart. I mark out roughly 6-inch intervals along the shear, fitting spacers around the frames as well as I can. The frame spacing turned out not to make this too difficult. Once I was happy with where these were, I could come back and glue them down, carefully aligning the top edge flush or just slightly proud of the shear line so I can sand that down if they're proud. Once glue is dried, I come back with a pencil, a saw, and a chisel to trim back the frames to make space for the inwale. This is another one of those simple woodworking tasks that make building a wooden boat like this enjoyable. I even had my wife help me on one of these. With a stern shelf, I'm not making transom hooks, so the angle where these meet, well anyways, you do this regardless, the angle where they mate with the transom gets marked and then cut. If they start to open up, I'll try a mechanical fastener before I clutter up the transom with the hook with an additional wood piece. Then the inwale goes back on and the front end gets marked and cut. It is recommended to do a breast hook first, which makes sense, but I did mine after the inwales were installed and it went okay. The inwale gets its final 11/16 thickness and those edges rounded over before a test fit. Be sure to make a second pass at fitment to clear those frames before glue. I use PL Premium on this glue up because the extra work time alleviates a lot of stress. On to breast hooks. I was mangling these breast hooks before I looked back at Ian Outred's excellent book about boat building, and I took his advice and made a pattern. Still, these parts require more patience than I have if they're going to advertise quality craftsmanship. I glued them together with PL Premium, hoping it would fill and hide my imperfect parts fitment. Onto the rudder and daggerboard. It's common practice to make these out of plywood, but I prefer to strip plank them. Plywood is much easier. You're likely going to get slicker surfaces with plywood than I get with my strip planking method. But these strip planked boards are very strong, and they're not hard to make beautiful. They say plywood boards are bound to eventually fail, which matches my experience. Half the grain isn't really contributing any strength. I've never had a strip planked board break, even with my questionable workmanship and lazy finishing. Some people might think to sheath these in fiberglass, and I've done it before with this big box store fir, but it seems to just bubble underneath the glass because the wood's kind of grained. And I don't leave my daggerboard down unless I'm sailing, so I'm not worried about this timber absorbing water, so I just finish them with oil or varnish and they last just fine. This 7/8 of an inch thick daggerboard got a hardwood strip on both the leading and the trailing edges. Now I'll talk about the process a little bit, which is the same as I make the rudder. As I play clips making the rudder, I'll talk about the process. The rudder is slightly thinner at 13/16 of an inch thick. You can start with as thick strips as you want to bring down to the appropriate thickness. I started with 1 inch thick strips. And my boards ended up with some spots that'll later get filled with thickened epoxy. I think it's especially important to have square strips to start with. Line all these up exceeding the desired dimensions. Roll all your planks 90 degrees. Then you can lay on glue and roll the planks back flat and clamp them together. I use plastic kitchen wrap and a couple boards to try to sandwich it all as flat as possible. Then when you pull off the clamps, you can cut the board to shape. After you've cut your board to the appropriate outline, you want to get close to what's called a NACA foil shape. This might seem trivial, but it has a serious influence on performance. Shaped correctly, you can maximize the low pressure made on the windward face of the board as it travels through the water. That increases performance on really all points of sail just about, but especially the windward. The idea is that you can produce lift as the water goes around that curve. Sharp turns produce turbidity, turbulent flow. Turbulent flow doesn't make pressure the same way that laminar flow does. At least that's what the scientists tell me. The blunt edge is the front edge. It's like the curve of a sail or an airplane wing. And then about a third of the way back from that leading edge, that should be the thickest part of the board. And then that curve trails off to a sharp trailing edge that some people cut square to leave strength. I draw a center line along the edges to help shape that foil, and then I come at it with an electric plane, a hand plane, and sandpaper. I'm trying to get it as flat as possible first and then put that hydrodynamic foil shape on it. Okay, the cassette rudder is another idea I copied from Michael Storer. It allows you to raise and lower the rudder without tilting it aft to make it waist tiller and port, like a barn door rudder. If you run aground, it stretches the bungee, it doesn't damage your rudder, and it's pieced together, so it's easy to modify or replace just one part at a time. I complicate the Storer version he does on the Goat Island Skiff. I complicate it further by making the tiller pivot on the cassette, and I make the rudder a pleasing spade shape, so the cassette shape has to be modified also. A 10-degree angle from vertical makes it match the transom rig. The slides of the sides, like the cheeks of the cassette, are another mirrored part that I just dab with hot glue and put it together and cut it as one piece. Once you've got all your parts cut out in that little spacer up front, don't glue this all together before the gudgeons are attached to the cheek. And you can test fit your rudder in there too. The cassette gudgeons are those hinge straps from Ace Hardware. Don't make the mistake of weak attachment points for pieces like these. You don't want to get stranded because your pintles and gudgeons are falling apart. In order to put its hinges at the rudder's center line, at the cassette's center line, I put a little bend in those hinge straps and carved out space for them to fit in the cassette. Then I can take those cheeks off the cassette and bolt the hinge to the cheek with a flush head bolt facing out. It might be easier to put a hinge on and just not even put a bend on it, just put it flat against the cheek and coming off the front. I've done it before, and you can't tell the difference in feel when you're operating the boat, but the gudgeons then need to be moved a little bit off center line, or you've got to open up your rudder, open up your that hole in the transom for the tiller off center. So symmetry is pretty. I complicate it a little bit by putting a bend in it in those gudgeons to get them centered. Next, the tiller, which is kind of a personality piece, a character piece in many boats. The important part of a cassette rudder is at the base of the tiller is a touch wider than the cassette, maybe a 16th of an inch or less, so that the tiller can have these wings on it that come and extend back around the cassette to exert the torque onto the cassette. I laminate 3 pieces that are 42 inches long. I laminate them together so my tiller has a channel down the middle. And that allows me to make a tiller extension and rest it in that channel. Before I clean up the front of the tiller for an extension, I put in a hinge at the cassette. Pin setup, the length of this pin should be just maybe 3/8 of an inch wider, half-inch wider than the wings on the tiller that come around the cassette, and round those ends of this pin off, and then keep those holes for the pins that'll keep all this together. Make those holes just kind of right on the edge of the fitment so that there isn't a whole lot of spare parts back here for the main sheet to get tangled in. Then I put it all back on the boat, and I can pin the cassette together and mark placement for a hinge stop. This is going to keep the tiller from just riding down on that shelf. All of this is a lot of work that you could just do an otherwise simpler version of this, but for me, it's all worth it to add to the experience of operating this boat. And then the last piece is the tiller extension. Square off a straight piece of wood so that it'll ride in that channel and cut it to about 36 inches long or so it reaches just short of the transom. I take off about a hand's width of the proud channel on the tiller to make it so that when I'm trying to grab the extension, it's not hidden down in that channel. Drill a hole near the tip of the tiller and the extension, and then use a thin wire to thread some twine through it. This is all just a fitment for now. This will all get cleaned up and the edges softened and the face is sanded and epoxied and primed and painted, all this in the next chapter. But right now, short of sails, this is a functioning boat. 2 more chapters remain. Finish work, rigging, and then the boat sails.